Just recently, a coalition of Trump allies has publicly exposed what they're calling systematic waste inside the Pentagon budget, and the defense industry is now facing questions it hasn't confronted in decades. Documents reveal billions in questionable contracts, cost overruns reaching historic levels, and procurement processes that critics say prioritize corporate profit over national security. What's unfolding isn't just another political skirmish. It's a fundamental challenge to the military-industrial relationship that has defined American defense spending for generations, and the implications reach far beyond Washington. But to understand why this is so significant, we need to look at the context. The Pentagon's annual budget exceeds $850 billion, making it one of the largest single expenditures in the federal government. For decades, this spending has operated with a level of scrutiny that critics argue is insufficient given the magnitude of taxpayer resources involved. Defense contractors, from aerospace giants to technology firms, have built business models around long-term government relationships that guarantee revenue streams spanning decades. The system works through a complex web of cost-plus contracts, classified programs, and procurement regulations that even seasoned lawmakers struggle to fully comprehend. Now, a group of Trump-aligned political figures and policy advocates are saying this system has become fundamentally broken. They're pointing to specific examples of what they characterize as egregious waste, demanding accountability, and threatening consequences that could reshape how America arms itself. Experts across the political spectrum are watching closely because the allegations being made and the evidence being presented suggest this isn't merely rhetorical posturing. Something substantial is happening. The revelation came in the form of a coordinated media strategy that unfolded over several days in late January 2025. Multiple Trump allies, including former administration officials and current congressional representatives aligned with the former president, began releasing information about Pentagon spending patterns they claim demonstrate systemic dysfunction. The specifics are striking. One example highlighted involves a major aerospace contractor that allegedly charged the Department of Defense $90,000 for a component that industry analysts say should cost less than $1,000 in commercial markets. Another case involves software systems purchased at prices experts describe as exponentially higher than comparable private sector solutions. The documentation includes internal Pentagon emails, contract details obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, and testimony from whistleblowers who worked inside defense acquisition offices. What makes these allegations particularly potent is the granular level of detail. This isn't vague criticism about government waste. These are line-item breakdowns, specific contract numbers, named companies, and documented price comparisons that create a narrative of systemic overcharging. The Trump allies releasing this information framed it explicitly as a national security issue, arguing that every dollar wasted on inflated contracts is a dollar not spent on readiness, on troop welfare, or on technological advancement that could provide America with strategic advantages against competitors like China and Russia. And what happened next reveals something even more critical. The immediate reaction from defense industry leaders was notably defensive. Within 48 hours of the initial revelations, trade associations representing major contractors issued statements emphasizing the complexity of defense manufacturing, the unique requirements of military specifications, and the long-term research and development costs that justify higher pricing. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing, companies that collectively receive over $100 billion annually in defense contracts, all released variations of the same message. They argued that comparing military-grade systems to commercial products ignores fundamental differences in durability requirements, security protocols, and performance standards. Industry representatives pointed out that defense contractors must maintain specialized facilities with security clearances, comply with extensive government oversight, and shoulder risks associated with cutting-edge technology development. But the public wasn't necessarily buying these explanations. Social media reaction was swift and largely critical of the defense industry. Polling data from late January showed that 73% of Americans believe there is significant waste in defense spending, a number that crosses partisan lines. Congressional reactions split predictably along political fault lines, but with some notable exceptions. Republican representatives aligned with Trump's America First wing embraced the revelations enthusiastically, calling for immediate investigations and threatening to condition future defense authorization bills on comprehensive auditing reforms. Traditional defense hawks in the Republican Party, however, expressed more measured concern, warning against cuts that could compromise military readiness while acknowledging that oversight improvements might be warranted. Democratic responses were more complex. Progressive Democrats who have long criticized defense spending levels saw an opportunity to advance arguments they've been making for years about reordering national priorities. Moderate and conservative Democrats, particularly those from districts with significant defense industry employment, urged caution and comprehensive analysis before drawing conclusions. But the immediate reactions only scratched the surface. The deep analysis reveals why this matters far beyond the typical Washington budget fight. Defense spending has historically enjoyed a unique position in American politics, largely insulated from the scrutiny applied to domestic programs. The reasons are multiple and reinforcing. National security concerns create political cover for generous budgets. The complexity and classified nature of many programs make independent verification difficult. The geographic distribution of defense contracts across congressional districts creates powerful constituencies for sustained spending. And the revolving door between the Pentagon, defense contractors, and congressional staff ensures that industry perspectives are well represented in policy discussions. As Margaret Brennan noted in a recent Face the Nation analysis, the Pentagon has failed its audit for the 6th consecutive year, unable to account for over $2 trillion in assets. This isn't money that's missing, but rather assets and expenditures that can't be properly tracked through the department's accounting systems. For any other federal agency, this would constitute a crisis demanding immediate remediation. For the Pentagon, it's become an accepted reality that generates bipartisan frustration, but little concrete action. Why does this matter? Because the Trump allies making these allegations aren't approaching this as deficit hawks concerned primarily with fiscal responsibility. They're framing it as a national security vulnerability. Their argument goes like this: America faces genuine strategic threats from near-peer competitors, particularly China, which is rapidly modernizing its military while spending a fraction of what the United States does. If a significant portion of American defense spending is being captured by inefficiency and corporate profit-taking rather than being converted into actual combat capability, then the United States is getting weaker even as spending increases. This reframing is politically powerful because it sidesteps the traditional debate about whether defense spending should increase or decrease. Instead, it focuses on whether Americans are getting value for the money already being spent. And it puts defense contractors in an uncomfortable position of having to defend specific pricing decisions rather than making broad arguments about national security needs. But history shows us that moments like these rarely unfold as expected. Previous attempts to reform defense procurement have a mixed record at best. The Packard Commission in the 1980s, formed after scandals involving $600 toilet seats and $7,000 coffee makers, produced recommendations that led to some procedural changes, but didn't fundamentally alter the underlying dynamics of defense contracting. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 reformed military command structures, but had limited impact on acquisition processes. More recently, attempts to implement more commercial-like practices through initiatives like better buying power yielded incremental improvements without transforming the system. The fundamental challenge is structural. Defense contractors operate in markets with extremely high barriers to entry, limited competition, and customers whose purchasing decisions are driven by political and strategic considerations as much as by price and performance. When there are only 2 or 3 companies capable of building fighter jets, normal market mechanisms don't apply. When programs take decades to complete and involve technologies that don't exist in commercial markets, cost overruns become almost inevitable. And when national security is invoked, budget discipline tends to weaken. Historical precedent also suggests that outrage over defense spending waste tends to be cyclical and short-lived. Public attention spikes around specific scandals, reforms are promised, some procedural changes are implemented, and then attention moves elsewhere while underlying patterns persist. What makes this moment potentially different is the political context. Trump has demonstrated a willingness to challenge Republican orthodoxies, including on foreign policy and military intervention. His allies in Congress represent a faction less reflexively deferential to defense industry priorities than previous generations of Republican lawmakers. And the scrutiny is emerging at a time when federal deficits are reaching levels that are generating genuine fiscal concern, even among politicians typically supportive of increased defense spending. But perhaps the most important historical lesson is this: the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in his 1961 farewell address has only become more entrenched in the decades since. The interweaving of defense contractors, Pentagon bureaucracies, congressional appropriators, and regional economies dependent on military spending creates a system highly resistant to fundamental change. Challenging it requires not just exposing waste, but building a sustainable political coalition capable of overcoming the formidable interests invested in the status quo. The geopolitical implications of this fight extend far beyond American domestic politics. America's ability to project military power globally depends not just on the size of its defense budget, but on the effectiveness with which that budget translates into actual capability. If significant portions of defense spending are being diverted into inefficiency and excess profit, the impact on American strategic position could be substantial. China is currently building modern naval vessels at a pace that exceeds American production by some measures, while spending roughly a third of what the United States does on defense. If China is extracting more capability per dollar spent, the implications for the Indo-Pacific military balance are serious. Military analysts have noted that in potential conflict scenarios over Taiwan or in the South China Sea, the raw numbers of available platforms, missiles, aircraft, and ships matter enormously. If American procurement inefficiency means fewer actual systems in the field despite higher spending, that's a strategic vulnerability that adversaries could exploit. Russia, despite a much smaller economy and defense budget, has managed to sustain a major military operation in Ukraine for nearly 3 years, partly by prioritizing cost-effective systems and accepting lower standards than Western militaries in some areas. The lesson some strategists are drawing is that expense doesn't automatically equal effectiveness. There are also implications for America's alliance relationships. NATO allies have long faced pressure to increase their defense spending to meet the 2% of GDP commitment. American credibility in making these demands is undermined if the United States itself is unable to efficiently manage its own vastly larger defense budget. Why should European allies accept lectures about fiscal responsibility in defense matters from a country that can't account for over $2 trillion in military assets? The broader question is whether defense procurement reform becomes a model for other aspects of federal spending, or whether it remains an isolated controversy. If Trump allies successfully force greater accountability and efficiency in Pentagon spending, it could embolden similar efforts targeting other departments and agencies. This could reshape federal governance in ways that extend far beyond the defense sector. The domestic political fallout is still developing, but early indicators suggest this could become a defining issue for the Republican Party's internal dynamics. Traditional defense hawks, including many senators and representatives who have built careers on supporting robust military spending, are finding themselves in an uncomfortable position. They can't easily dismiss concerns about waste without seeming indifferent to taxpayer interests. But they also can't embrace radical reform proposals without risking relationships with defense industry constituents that provide both campaign contributions and employment in their districts. The Trump wing of the party, meanwhile, sees an opportunity to distinguish itself from what it characterizes as establishment corruption and corporate cronyism. Several America First Republicans have already introduced legislation that would impose new auditing requirements, cap certain types of contract profit margins, and increase transparency around classified program spending. These proposals face uncertain prospects in a closely divided Congress, but they're forcing conversations that the defense industry would prefer to avoid. Congressional oversight committees are gearing up for hearings that could prove highly consequential. The House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and various appropriations subcommittees all have jurisdiction over different aspects of defense spending. Early indications suggest that multiple hearings will be scheduled, featuring testimony from Pentagon acquisition officials, defense contractor executives, independent auditors, and whistleblowers. These hearings could produce viral moments that shape public perception and create political pressure for action. There's also the possibility of Inspector General investigations and Government Accountability Office audits that could provide authoritative assessment of the allegations being made. Legal challenges may emerge as well. Some of the contracts being criticized were awarded through processes that, while perhaps inefficient or poorly structured, were technically legal under existing procurement regulations. Changing those regulations requires congressional action. But if evidence emerges of actual fraud, false claims, or violations of existing law, that could trigger Justice Department involvement and potentially criminal or civil liability for companies and individuals involved. Public opinion is a wild card. Defense spending typically doesn't rank among voters' top concerns in polling, well behind issues like healthcare costs, immigration, and economic conditions. But if the narrative of defense contractor excess becomes sufficiently salient, it could drive political pressure that overcomes the structural advantages the industry typically enjoys. Much depends on whether media coverage sustains attention on these issues or moves on to other topics, and the domestic ramifications are just beginning to emerge. The economic and market impact has been notable even in these early stages. Defense contractor stocks experienced volatility in the days following the initial revelations, with some major companies seeing share prices decline by 3 to 5% before partially recovering. While this isn't a catastrophic market reaction, it reflects investor uncertainty about the political and regulatory environment these companies may face. Financial analysts covering the defense sector have begun incorporating what they call political risk premium into their assessments. Several major investment firms downgraded certain defense stocks from buy to hold recommendations, citing concerns about potential margin compression if procurement reforms are enacted. The concern isn't necessarily that overall defense spending will decline. Most analysts expect the strategic environment, particularly regarding China, to keep pressure on maintaining or even increasing top-line defense budgets. The worry is that money could be redirected away from traditional prime contractors toward alternative approaches. This could include more direct government development of certain technologies, greater emphasis on commercial off-the-shelf solutions, or deliberate efforts to cultivate new entrants to defense markets to increase competition. For the companies most dependent on Pentagon contracts, this represents a genuine business risk. Lockheed Martin derives approximately 75% of its revenue from government contracts, predominantly defense. Boeing's defense division, while smaller than its commercial aircraft business, represents a critical profit center, especially given the well-documented challenges in the commercial sector. Raytheon Technologies and Northrop Grumman are similarly dependent on stable, profitable defense relationships. Any significant disruption to their business models could have cascading effects through their supply chains, affecting thousands of smaller contractors and subcontractors. Some market observers see potential opportunities in this disruption. Companies focused on more innovative, cost-effective approaches to defense technology could benefit if procurement reforms create openings for new entrants. Silicon Valley defense technology startups like Anduril and Shield AI, which have positioned themselves as challengers to traditional primes, could find a more receptive environment. Private space companies like SpaceX, which has already disrupted launch services with dramatically lower costs than traditional providers, might see expanded opportunities. The broader economic impact depends heavily on how any reforms are structured. Defense spending supports millions of jobs across all 50 states, carefully distributed through congressional influence over contract awards. Any significant reallocation of this spending creates winners and losers in regional economies. The media narrative and information warfare surrounding this story has been intense from the outset. Conservative media outlets aligned with Trump have given the revelations extensive coverage, treating it as confirmation of long-held suspicions about swamp corruption and corporate capture of government. Fox News, Newsmax, and various conservative online platforms have featured the story prominently, often framing it as Trump allies fighting on behalf of ordinary taxpayers against entrenched interests. Mainstream media coverage has been more measured but still substantial. Major newspapers and networks have covered the allegations while also including industry responses and expert analysis, questioning some of the specific comparisons being made. The challenge for journalists is that defense procurement is genuinely complex, making simple narratives of waste sometimes misleading, even when the underlying concerns are valid. A $90,000 component might sound outrageous compared to commercial prices, but if it must function reliably in extreme conditions, last for decades, and be producible in small quantities, the price differential might be more justified than it initially appears. Progressive media has embraced the story enthusiastically, but with a different emphasis, using it to argue for reordering national priorities away from military spending toward domestic social programs. This creates an unusual left-right convergence on criticism of defense spending, though with very different motivations and policy prescriptions. Social media has amplified the most dramatic elements of the story while often stripping away nuance. Viral posts highlighting specific examples of alleged overcharging spread rapidly, generating outrage but not necessarily deeper understanding. The information environment is further complicated by the involvement of classified programs. Some of the spending being questioned involves secret initiatives that can't be publicly detailed. This creates asymmetry where critics can point to large sums without clear justification, while defenders can't fully explain the rationale without revealing classified information. What happens next depends on several key variables, and multiple scenarios are possible. In the best-case scenario, this moment catalyzes genuine reform that improves Pentagon efficiency without compromising national security. Congressional investigations produce specific, actionable recommendations. Bipartisan coalitions emerge around particular reforms like enhanced auditing requirements, increased competition in contracting, and better cost controls. The defense industry, recognizing the political winds, cooperates with reasonable reform efforts to avoid more draconian measures. New technologies and acquisition approaches are tested and, where successful, scaled. Over several years, measurable improvements in cost effectiveness emerge. America gets more military capability for each dollar spent, improving strategic position relative to competitors. The process also increases public confidence in defense spending, making it easier to sustain necessary investments. This scenario isn't impossible, but it requires sustained political will, competent implementation, and avoiding both the extremes of slashing critical capabilities and maintaining an inefficient status quo. In the worst-case scenario, the controversy becomes purely partisan, reforms are blocked by industry lobbying and congressional resistance, and the entire episode ends up being political theater without substantive change. Defense contractors weather the storm through aggressive lobbying, campaign contributions to key lawmakers, and mobilization of employees and communities dependent on defense spending to pressure their representatives. After some congressional hearings that generate headlines but little action, appropriations continue largely as before. The lack of follow-through demoralizes reform advocates and reinforces cynicism about the possibility of challenging entrenched interests. Meanwhile, the political fight itself creates distraction and uncertainty that disrupts needed programs, delays procurement decisions, and creates gaps in capability that adversaries exploit. The most likely scenario falls somewhere between these extremes. Some reforms are enacted, producing incremental improvements without fundamentally transforming the system. Certain egregious examples of waste are addressed, creating political wins for reformers. The Pentagon implements new auditing systems and oversight mechanisms that provide better visibility into spending, though full accountability remains elusive. Competition increases in some technology areas, particularly those where commercial sector innovation is applicable, while traditional prime contractors maintain dominance in complex platforms like aircraft and ships. Defense spending continues to grow in absolute terms, driven by strategic competition with China, but budget pressures force some difficult choices about priorities. But perhaps the most critical question is whether this represents a temporary political opportunity or a more fundamental shift in how Americans think about defense spending and national security. For decades, the consensus around robust military budgets has been one of the most stable features of American politics, transcending partisan divisions. Yes, there have been debates about specific weapons systems, about intervention strategies, about the balance between defense and diplomacy. But the basic proposition that America should maintain overwhelming military superiority and that this requires massive, sustained investment has gone largely unchallenged by mainstream political figures. What's emerging now is different. It's not just progressive Democrats arguing for cutting defense spending to fund social programs, a position that's been politically marginal. It's a growing faction within the Republican Party, aligned with the party's dominant political figure, questioning whether current defense spending actually translates into national security. This is potentially a realigning development. If defense spending becomes a wedge issue within the Republican Party, it scrambles political coalitions in unpredictable ways. Defense contractors have traditionally been reliable Republican allies, contributing heavily to campaigns and providing political support for GOP candidates. If that relationship becomes adversarial or even just transactional, it changes the political landscape. The broader pattern this connects to is a general erosion of institutional trust and elite consensus in American politics. Defense contractors, like other major corporations, pharmaceutical companies, tech giants, financial institutions, have seen public trust decline significantly over the past 2 decades. When Trump allies frame defense procurement waste as another example of elites enriching themselves at public expense, it resonates with broader populist themes that have reshaped both parties. The implications for American foreign policy are profound and multifaceted. The credibility of American military power rests not just on the size of defense budgets, but on the perception that those budgets translate into actual capability. If allies and adversaries come to believe that American defense spending is significantly less efficient than alternatives, it affects strategic calculations. A Chinese military planner assessing the balance of power in the Western Pacific isn't just counting American carriers and aircraft. They're evaluating whether American systems can be produced and sustained at the pace and scale necessary for prolonged conflict. American alliances depend on the belief that the United States has both the capability and the will to honor security commitments. European allies, Asian partners, Middle Eastern friends all base their own strategic planning on assumptions about American military power. If doubts emerge about American efficiency and readiness, it could accelerate trends toward strategic autonomy. There are also implications for global power dynamics beyond the bilateral competition with China. The potential for reduced American influence is real if military dominance appears to be eroding. Regional stability in multiple theaters depends partly on American security guarantees and military presence. Democratic norms and civil-military relations also factor into this story in subtle but important ways. The Pentagon's inability to pass an audit represents a failure of basic accountability that would be unacceptable in any other context. In a democracy, elected representatives are supposed to exercise meaningful oversight over how public resources are spent, especially in an area as sensitive as national defense. As defense analyst Michelle Flournoy has noted, the fundamental question is whether the United States can adapt its defense establishment to 21st century threats at a pace rapid enough to maintain strategic advantage. The threats America faces are increasingly technological, requiring rapid innovation, software sophistication, and integration of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. Traditional procurement processes designed for building ships and aircraft over decades are poorly suited to technologies that evolve in months or years. This mismatch between threat evolution and institutional adaptation is perhaps the deepest problem the current controversy is highlighting. Even if specific allegations about waste are addressed, the structural challenge remains of how a bureaucratic system can move at the speed necessary to maintain advantage against competitors who have designed their approaches specifically to exploit American vulnerabilities. China's military modernization isn't just about copying American systems, it's about developing capabilities specifically intended to target weaknesses in American approaches, whether those are technological, operational, or institutional. And this is far from over. The investigations are just beginning. Congressional hearings will unfold over months, potentially years. The 2026 Defense Authorization Bill will be a critical test of whether reform proposals gain traction or get watered down. New revelations are likely to emerge as whistleblowers feel emboldened and journalists dig deeper. The defense industry will mount increasingly sophisticated resistance. Strategic competitors will probe for weaknesses and opportunities. The American public will render its judgment through polls, elections, and the level of sustained attention it gives to these issues. This is a developing situation with implications that will ripple through American defense policy, strategic posture, alliance relationships, and global power dynamics for years to come. If you're following this story and want clear, fact-driven analysis without hype, this is exactly the kind of deep examination that cuts through the noise. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially on what you think the appropriate balance is between efficiency and readiness. What do you think the long-term consequences will be if significant procurement reforms are enacted versus if the status quo is maintained? Subscribe for continued coverage and expert analysis as this story develops. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates.